Hello fellow cyborgs, and welcome to another video in which I tell you, well, I haven't made another one of these, but today I'm going to talk about Victorian-adjacent books. So I recently read two books that kind of went with Victober, but since they were not written in the Victorian period, didn't count for Victober, but I wanted to talk about both of them since I quite enjoyed them and I thought I'd do it in here. So first, I did participate in the read-along hosted by Katie from Books and Things of Bellman and Black by Diane Setterfield. This we read in September right before Victober, and it was so good to get me into the Victober spirit. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Jack Davenport, otherwise known as Commodore Norrington from the Pirates of the Caribbean films. He did an awesome job. I really enjoyed this. I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. I highly recommend the audiobook experience, but I'm sure that I would have enjoyed this book if I had read it physically as well. So this story follows the life of William Bellman. It's been a while since I listened to this, and it starts when he's a child and he accidentally on purpose kills a rook. Rooks are a huge imagery part of this story and a huge imagery thing for William's life. This takes place in the Victorian era. He ends up working at a mill and ends up being really, really good at that and owning the mill himself. Eventually, he meets Mr. Black, this very mysterious person who kind of becomes his business partner. Bellman decides to completely change his line of work and opens a kind of like funerary department store. A lot of people died in the Victorian era. There's just so many things that could kill you, and the Victorians had a lot of really intense death customs. You see how this is explored through the products that Bellman and his company, Bellman and Black, offer. It was so much fun. I kind of wanted to go shopping there, even though, thank goodness, I have no reason to. Let's hope, knocking on wood, that I don't anytime soon. Because of that funerary shift in the second half of this book, this definitely feels somber and ghoulish and just like so spooky and perfect. It definitely wasn't scary or anything, but just the mood very much reminds me of walking through a forest where all of the trees have no more leaves on them and it's a little bit misty on the ground. I don't think I want to say any more about this, but it just really got me in the mood for Victober. I didn't expect to love this as much as I did. I had previously heard that this is kind of a dream-like book, and the plot is definitely more structured and linear than I expected it to be, but maybe if you thought this was a very just normal sort of plot, you might be a little thrown off. I'm not really sure. I can only talk about my experience. Also, there were, was it 1 or like 2 kind of sex scenes that I was like, oh, this is happening now. So just to let you know, I didn't like expect that. It wasn't like a bad thing, but it was like, oh, okay, I'll remember that when I go to reread this. So that's Bellman and Black, a Victorian tangential novel by Diane Setterfield. I then read a Victorian-adjacent true crime nonfiction called The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher. I'll have to read the subtitle to you. A Shocking Murder and the Undoing of a Great Victorian Detective. This is by Kate Summerscale, and I don't know who narrated it. I got it from the library, and they're not good at labeling their narrators. Oh, just kidding, it's Simon Vance. Should have assumed. So this is a blend of a true crime nonfiction and also a nonfiction about the origins of the literary detective. So Mr. Witcher, Detective Witcher, was one of the 6, I think, detectives at this point in the Victorian era. In 1860, a 3-year-old named Savile Kent is found fairly brutally murdered on his family estate. The local police deal with this for a while, and then eventually Detective Witcher is called in to come and try to figure out what happened. But as it turns out, he has an unpopular opinion, and the case is kind of just swept under the rug. We then look at the figure of Detective Witcher and look at how he and similar detectives around him at the time were represented in literature. This was still a fairly new profession, so we learn about what a beat cop's profession actually looked like. Their feet must have hurt so much. There was no arch support back then. And we also get to hear about some fairly famous literary detectives, Sherlock Holmes. But here's kind of where this work falls short for me, is that Summerscale finds it somehow necessary within this work of nonfiction to spoil like 5 Victorian works of literature because they have detectives in them. Instead of being vague and talking about the detective finding the criminal, she often tells you who that criminal is. thereby spoiling the plot of some pretty major Victorian works. In the process of talking about literary detectives, Summerscale spoils Jane Eyre, Bleak House, The Moonstone, The Woman in White, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, and Lady Audley's Secret. I don't think this was necessary, and this is something that has not been completely confined to this book. This is something I've noticed in other nonfictions that kind of intersect with book criticism. I find it incredibly frustrating and incredibly unnecessary. It bums me out because I definitely think this is a good book, and I really love that we got to hear about literary detectives, but I think it's really unfair to say if you have any interest in these books at all, you need to read all of them before you read this, or else spoil pretty major plot twists for these books that rely a lot on their plot. Mild tangent over. This, for being what seems like an unsolved mystery during the major part of this, has a very satisfying ending. That was something I was really surprised by. I assumed I'd just be left with speculation. And it was really interesting to hear literary detectives talked about. That made me kind of want to read some of the books that I hadn't thought about picking up and reread Bleak House because it just sounds amazing. But I pretty much lowered my rating of this by 1 star solely because of all that spoiling. It just frustrated me to no end. And there was an awful lot of detail that was put into this book, and I think that perhaps the audiobook experience made that a little bit more difficult to digest. So this got 3 out of 5 stars from me instead of my hoped for 4 or 5, but that's okay. It was still a good experience, and I would probably be interested in rereading this at some point. So those were 2 Victorian adjacent audiobooks that I had to talk with you today. Please let me know in the comments down below if you have any more Victober adjacent works that I definitely need to pick up. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, continue to be lovely.